chauvinist assertion of this identity. So basically, the theory is that the Assyrians of the time chose Christianity as a way of making themselves a cohesive group and of making themselves separate from the other pagan groups around them so that they wouldn't have to intermix with them. Now here you can find a more detailed map of the various dioceses that made up the Metropolitan Archdiocese of Arthur or Assyria, and you will notice that the earliest one is that of Erbil, which was established in 104 AD, and that this area going up to the Hakkari highlands of southeastern Turkey and the Urmia region of northwest Iran all constituted what the local Christians perceived as historical Assyria for them. And they were all closely tied to either Erbil or Mosul. And this diocese persisted as a diocese of the Church of the East until 1813, when it later became subsumed into the Chaldean Catholic Church. So we find also in Islamic sources, this one from the 8th century, that the Assyrians are mentioned. For example, Ibn Nadim, in his Fihrist, mentions a group known as the Ashuriyun, which was a Christian group. And again, we find maps produced by Europeans. This is a European map of the Persian Empire, and I think it's from the 1500s, late 1500s. You can clearly see that they've marked an area as Assyria. In a map of the Turkish Empire from 1626, you see in the margins an Assyrian and his wife as part of the people that lived in those areas. And it's interesting because Kurdistan doesn't appear as a geographical term in any of these maps until the end of the 1600s. So before the end of the 1600s, in any maps of the area, there is no mention of Kurdistan. And there is no mention of Chaldean people or Aramean people living in the north of Mesopotamia. The only identification of northern Mesopotamia and its Christian population before this time, whether it be local or foreign, is of an Assyrian identity. Again, these are some other maps from the 15 and 1600s showing Assyria as part of that area. Now I'm going to move, before I move on, I'm going to say that the Assyrian identity geographically appears to have been continuous in the same area for a total of nearly 2.5 millennia. It never went away, even though the Arabs and Kurds gradually became the dominant ethnic groups in the area. And some Assyrians changed their religion or changed their sects and names to those of people from other geographical areas, such as Chaldeans, who are actually from southern Iraq. Now, if there were no Assyrian people living in these areas, with no Assyrian identity, in all of these time periods, all of this recurrent usage of the geographical term Assyria would have been impossible. If there had been no Assyrians living in northern Mesopotamia, we would not find people in the late Antique period or the Middle Ages referring to a group of people called the Assyrians that lived in northern Mesopotamia. They would be referring to Chaldeans or Arameans, and that is not the case. So, moving on to Syriac literature, and Syriac being a major part of Assyrian identity. We find, for example, a lot of motifs that go back to ancient Mesopotamia or the ancient Assyrians. One of them being the Syriac Acts of the martyr Sharbel, who was supposed to have died in 107 AD. And the Acts of the martyr Sharbel attest to the celebration of the ancient Assyrian New Year festival, or the Akitu Spring Festival, in the city of Edessa. You also have a Narseh, king of the Assyrians, who converted to Christianity, mentioned in the doctrine of Saint Adai the Apostle, which is from roughly 400 AD. The Acts of Saint Mari from the 5th century AD, calls Assyria the country of the Syrians or the Suryaye, and includes references to ancient Mesopotamian practices such as the communal assembly or pukhra, from the Akkadian word pukhru. Now, according to the 6th century history of the martyrs of Bet Sluch or Kirkuk, the city was founded by the Assyrian ruler Sardana, and after Sargon built a palace there, it was called Karkhat Sargon, or the Fortress of Sargon. According to Patricia Crone, again, author of Hagarism, she says that in the history of Karkhat the Bet Sluch, begins with the Assyrian kings and ends with the Assyrian martyrs. Sargon founded it, and the martyrs made it a blessed field for Christianity. Likewise, in the 7th century before Christ, all the world stood in awe of Sardana, and in the 7th century after Christ, the saints took his place as the son of Arthur and the glory of Nineveh. Also, popular in Syriac literature are the story and proverbs of Ahikar the Wise, an Aramean sage at the courts of King Sennacherib and King Esarhaddon. According to Syriac texts, this very Sardana, or Esarhaddon, 32nd king of Assyria after Pelos and ruler of a third of the inhabited world, submitted to the monotheistic message of the prophet Jonah and instituted the Ninevite fast, which saved Nineveh from destruction. Now, a lot of people may not know, but the Syriac churches today, whether it be the Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, or the Syriac Orthodox and Catholic churches, all have a 3-day fast every year, which they call the Rogation of the Ninevites. Now, this was reinstituted by a metropolitan or an archbishop called Sabrisha of Kirkuk, roughly 1,000 years afterwards, to save the local Assyrians from a plague. In other words, there is the theory that Assyrians were monotheists before Christ and Christians after him, and that the past therefore led to the present without a break. So just to show some more examples of the mention of Assyrians in classical Syriac literature, we have here the Doctrine of Adad the Apostle, where he talks about Narsai, king of the Assyrians, and the people within the country of the Assyrians converting to Christianity. And moving on, I'm going to talk as well about saints within Syriac Christianity that are said to be descended from Assyrian royalty. Now, among them are Saints Behnam and Sarah, who died in roughly 350 AD. They are said to be the children of a local governor under the Sassanids, whose name was Sennacherib. The monastery of Saint Behnam and Sarah was recently destroyed by ISIS. Then you have Saint Qardach, who lived in the 4th century, who in his history or in his vita is said to be a descendant on his father's side of Sennacherib and a descendant on his mother's side of Nimrod. And here you can see the actual translation from his vita, which says that he came from the great race and lineage of the kingdom of the Assyrians. And then also we have Saint Zena, the bishop of Beth Roman, and his sister Sarah, who lived in the 7th century AD. Now, I made a map basically comparing 3 things. The red shows the areas closely associated with these 3 groups of saints that are said to be descended from Assyrian royalty. The black are ancient Assyrian cities, which we know from the Neo-Assyrian period, and the blue are modern Assyrian villages or places where Assyrians live today. And you can see that they're almost contiguous with one another. They basically come from the same geographical area. In this image, we can also see how important Ahikar the Wise, or the sage from the courts of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, was in the Syriac period. For people of Syriac language or heritage, they basically put Ahikar on the same level as Plato, Galen, and Aristotle, who were the classical main philosophers of the classical world. Now, going into church fathers and Christian writers, We have Tatian the Assyrian, who himself writes that he was born in the land of the Assyrians. You have Lucian of Samosata, who was an Assyrian. You have St. Ephraim Cyrus, Dionysius of Telemachre, Bar Hebraeus, who all mention the Assyrians in their texts, as well as Giwargisward of Arbil from the 13th century, who also mentions the Assyrians as a living ethnic group. So within his famous book of memoirs and soritas, which is used within the Church of the East, he actually says, "O Lord, heed the rogation of the Babylonians and Assyrians now that church leadership is in disarray." And also, from the 12th century, we have the texts of Michael the Great, Patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church, who wrote a humongous chronography or world history. Within it, we find that he has a list of the peoples who had literature or who could read and write, and among them he lists the Assyrians, who are the Syrians. So here he equates the two words Assyrian and Syrian with one another. Athurayed Hannun Suriyayed. He also has a longer quote, which is in the next slide, that he says that even if their name is Syrian, they are originally Assyrians, and they have had many honorable kings. Syria is in the west of the Euphrates, and its inhabitants who are talking our Aramaic language and who are so-called Syrians are only part of the whole, while the other part, which is in the east of the Euphrates going to Persia, had many kings from Assyria and Babylon and Urhai, or Edessa. Assyrians, who were called Syrians by the Greeks, were also the same Assyrians, I mean Assyrians from Assur, who built the city of Nineveh. And here you can see that full quote, and I've actually highlighted an area where he equates Ashur with Assur and says that from Assur came the Assuraye. And I'm going to get back to that point a little bit later. Back to Giwargiswarda of Arbil, we find in one of his homilies, he has a long poetical homily where he lists all of the patriarchs of the Church of the East, and among them are at least 5 whom he calls ethnic Assyrians. He says that they were Assyrians. So obviously Assyrian identity was still existent, was still strong. We find with the conversion of a number of Assyrians to Catholicism in the 16th and 17th centuries, that with the creation of what we know today as the Chaldean Catholic Church, the first patriarchs of this church, or the first prelates of this church, both referred to themselves and were referred to by the Roman Catholic Church as Eastern Assyrians. Okay, so within the 16th century, there are plenty of references to Eastern Assyrians, or Patriarch of Mosul and Assyria. Here you can see another one from 1585, Abdishu, Patriarch of the Assyrians, and again from 1606, Assyrians and Indians unjustly named Nestorians. Now there is a theory current in scholarship today that the Assyrian identity was one given to people from the Church of the East, specifically by the British in the 19th century, after the discovery of Nineveh and Nimrud, and with a political agenda. This is maybe 200 years before that period, or 300 years before that period. So there were people both identifying themselves as Assyrians and being called Assyrians by their neighbors and by people in the Western world, even before the discovery of the Assyrian ruins at Nineveh. One of the most interesting cases is that of the wife of Pietro della Valle. Now, Pietro della Valle was a Roman aristocrat. He was Italian, lived in the early 1600s, and he was an explorer that went to Baghdad, and he was famous for marrying a local Christian girl whom he only knew from a painting that he'd seen in Jerusalem. So he traveled all the way to Baghdad to marry her. Now this girl was a Christian girl who was born in the city of Mardin, which is now in southeastern Turkey, and later moved with her family to Baghdad. And when she died, he was devastated, and he wrote many books about her in many languages, and in one of them you can see she is called an Assyrian girl, she is called Assyrian chrétienne, an Assyrian Christian, she is also in one of them called an Assyrian goddess. And in this book from 1627, which was produced at her funeral in Italy, she is called Nazione Assyria, from the Assyrian nation, Patria Mardinites, so from the city of Mardin. Okay, so she is called an Assyrian. And again, there are some other examples from the 1600s of Assyrian identity, or of Chaldean Catholic patriarchs being called the Patriarch of the Assyrians. One of the most interesting is this couple of quotes from 1844 by Horatio Southgate. And Horatio Southgate was a missionary and an explorer from America, but he was being employed by the Episcopalian Church in England to go and build a relationship between the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Church of England. So in his first contact with the Syrian Orthodox people in a town called Kharput, which was roughly 360 miles to the northwest of Nineveh, he looks for a people who he's calling Suryani, but nobody there knows who the Suryani are. And he says that I observed that the Armenians did not know them under the name which I used, Suryani, but called them Asuri, which struck me the more at the moment from its resemblance to our English name, Assyrians, from whom they claim their origin, being sons, as they say, of Ashur, or Asur. So it's interesting because the Syriac Orthodox Christians of Kharput clearly identified themselves as Assyrians and as the sons of Ashur, and they said that they were descended from, or originated from, the Assyrians in 1844, which is at least a year or two prior to the excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, over 360 miles away, and decades before the development of Assyrian nationalism. So, I should have told people to turn their phones off. I don't have much to go, but I'm going to go quickly through the rest of my presentation. With regards to language, okay, the switch to Aramaic had already begun in the 8th century BC in the Assyrian Empire, and the language that the modern-day group of Assyrians speak is called Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, which equates to Assyrian Aramaic, and I'm going to show why in a little bit. Now, this dialect of Aramaic has a lot of Akkadian vocabulary, especially in regards to agriculture and domestic items. For example, the word for a grain storeroom comes from Akkadian, the word for a pile of straw comes from Akkadian, the word for a rice paddy or a gate all come from Akkadian and have no link to any other Semitic languages. Now, I apologize that this map is in Russian, but it's a very good map of the Assyrian heartland. You can see, for example, all these colored areas are areas of dialect groups, of modern Assyrian dialect groups. For example, here is Turabdin, where they speak Western Assyrian, Botan, Fan, Urmia Salamas, Erbil, the Nineveh Plain, Hakkari. You can see that all of these areas are connected with one another geographically. And they are all in and around northern Mesopotamia or Assyria proper. Another Russian map, I apologize, this is the last Russian map I'll be showing. The shaded area represents where the Aramaic language has historically been spoken at its greatest extent. And when they break this geographic area up into East and West, so Eastern Aramaic, Western Aramaic, by Eastern Aramaic they're referring to either one of two things, either the Euphrates River, which is right here, or the border between the two great empires, which is shown here. So anything to the east of that is Eastern Aramaic. And when they are saying Northeastern Aramaic, they are referring to the northern part of that area, which is here, and is really historic Assyria. So anybody that is calling what the modern Assyrians speak Northwestern Aramaic is indirectly calling it Assyrian Aramaic, geographically speaking. If it were, hypothetically, Chaldean Neo-Aramaic, then it would have to come from Chaldea, which means that it's not Northeastern Neo-Aramaic at all. If Chaldean was a Neo-Aramaic language, it would be called Southeastern Neo-Aramaic, and that's not what linguists call it today. Now, interestingly, I would like to draw your attention to the map on the left, which again shows the greatest extent of the Aramaic language being spoken and used in the ancient world or in the Middle East. And on the right, a map of the greatest extent of the Assyrian Empire in roughly 700 BC, and you will notice that they are almost exactly the same. It was the ancient Assyrian Empire which made Aramaic a language of trade and diplomacy. It was the ancient Assyrian Empire which, through its own administration, made Aramaic a language which then became so widespread. So Aramaic was, in essence, a language of the Assyrian Empire. It was an Assyrian language. Without the Assyrian Empire making Aramaic such an important language, Aramaic would not have this extent. So the growth of Aramaic is intimately tied with the extent of the ancient Assyrian Empire. Now, on to one of my final important points, the survival not only of the geographical entity, whether it be a region or a province called Assyria, but also the survival of the Assyrian identity and national name. Now, all Aramaic-speaking Christians, originally from northern Mesopotamia, know themselves by two things, either as Suraye or Suroye, depending on the dialect, or Suriaye, Suryoye, which is what they actually write in classical Syriac. Now, both of these names developed from the ancient Assyrian ethnic designation Ashurayi, which later became Asurai. Now, in Arabic, the Assyrians are known as Suryan, Suryan, and this developed from the Persian term Asuriyan, Assyrians. Asuriyan, Suryan, Suryani, Assyrians. And obviously there are Eastern Assyrians and Western Assyrians. Here you can see, for example, in a book, in one of the liturgical books of the Chaldean Catholic Church, that the Chaldean Catholics are called Suryaye Madanhaye, Eastern Syriacs or Eastern Syrians, Assyriorum Orientalium, as you can see here, which are Chaldeans. Now, the equation of Assyria and Syria with one another has been firmly established by Professor Richard Nelson Fry, the late Professor Fry, as well as Professor Seymour Porpola. Now, interestingly, there is a recent article by Professor Robert Rollinger where he translates a bilingual inscription from the 8th century BC, which was excavated at a site in Turkey called Çineköy. And this bilingual inscription has one side basically in Phoenician, which talks about a king of Ashur, okay? And on the other side, it's in a language called Luwian, which talks about a king of Sur. So here we see that even as early as the 8th century BC, there was Ashur and Sur, which meant the same thing. Ashuraya, Suraya. So the endonym, which is an autonym or which is a name from within an ethnic group, is the name Suraya or Suroyo, and we see the development, the two theories for the development of this name. It could have either developed from Ashurayu, which later became Asurayu, and then Surayu, Suraya, and the same can be said for the language. So modern day Assyrians call their language Surat, Surat, Surath, etc. There is also the theory that that comes from Lishanum Ashuritum, which then became Asuritum, Suritum, Surat, the Assyrian language. The second theory is that Suraya probably comes also from Arthuraya. Remember the geographical term Arthura. Arthuraya, which then became Asuraya, and then Suraya. Now, within these languages, it is very common for these sounds th, sh, s, and t to be interchangeable with one another. Hence, we find, for example, between related Semitic languages, the word for bull. In Aramaic it's Taura, in Arabic it's Thur, in Hebrew it's Shur. Or in various dialects of modern Assyrian or modern Aramaic, the word for house can be Betha, it can be Beta, it can be Besha, or it can be Besa. So we also have Asuraya, Ashuraya, Arthuraya, and Arturaya, interchangeable with one another. Now, something that I was working on before I came to the United States, which was nearly 2 months ago now, I noticed that the word Surat for the language in modern Aramaic or in modern Assyrian is an adjectival form of feminine gender. However, the word for language, Lishana, is masculine. So something that I had been trying to work out, or something that I had been struggling with, was why in modern Assyrian would a feminine adjective be used to describe a masculine word? So I thought I'd look at cognate languages or related languages. In Arabic, for example, the word lisan is masculine except for when referring to languages. In Hebrew, lashon is almost always feminine but can sometimes be masculine, whereas in Akkadian, lishanu is always feminine in gender. Therefore, the fact that a feminine adjective is being used to describe a masculine word in modern Assyrian doesn't come from Aramaic at all, but comes from Akkadian. So it's more than 2,600 years old. So people told me this is preposterous. The ancient Assyrians called their language Akkadian. They didn't call it Assyrian. So I had a look at the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. And, believe it or not, the ancient Assyrians often actually did call their language Asuritu or Asuraitu, Assyrian, in agreement with the gender of the word Lishan, or language. So I thought that would be a very interesting thing to bring up, as well as one of the earliest instances where the word Suraya is equated with the word Assyrian. This is an entry from the Chaldean Arabic Dictionary of Bishop Jacob Eugene Manna from 1900, and he was a bishop of the Chaldean Catholic Church, and the entry reads, Suraya means Syriac, Aramaic, or Christian, and it is an abbreviation of Asuraya, meaning Arthuraya, Assyrian. Now, I'm not going to go into this too much. I'm just going to briefly mention exonyms referring to the Assyrians. So basically, words used by neighboring peoples to refer to this one ethnic group. For example, we have in classical Persian, Asuri. In Georgian, we have Asureli. And in Armenian, we have Asuri. Now, there has been the argument that Asuri refers to Syrians, and the word in Armenian referring to Assyrians is actually Asurestansi. but that was cleared up to me by a native Armenian speaker. Asure Stansi in Armenian basically means the inhabitant of a hypothetical Assyrian state. So an Assyrian living in Armenia would be an Armenian citizen or a higher Stansi, using the same analogy. So, moving on, we find the names of many modern-day Assyrian settlements in ancient Akkadian texts. So, just going through a few of them: Betkari, Isla, Nerwa, Azakh, etc. These all show up in ancient Akkadian texts as well as medieval Syriac texts, and many of them well into the modern period are still Assyrian places of inhabitation. Especially within the Nineveh plain, but also in other areas, we find that Assyrian settlements are either built on or very close to tells or archaeological mounds, within which are the remains of ancient Assyrian structures or cities. And here you can see some of them. To the top left, for example, is the monastery of St. George, Chaldean Catholic monastery of St. George, just north of Mosul, which is built on an archaeological mound with ancient Assyrian ruins in it. On the top right is the Church of St. Barbara in the town of Karmlish, and it is also built on top of an archaeological mound. And the name Karmlish, now the village of Karmlish is in the Nineveh plain, so it was actually, this church was destroyed by ISIS last Sunday, and the other monastery was destroyed by ISIS last year. Karmlish comes from Akkadian. Okay, the name Karmlish is an Akkadian name. It means Kar Molisi, the fortress of Molisi, who was the wife of the god Ashur. To the bottom left is one of the villages of the Nineveh plain. I think it's Al-Bosh, and you can see here that the cemetery is actually built on an archaeological mound. And here, to the bottom right, is an archaeological mound called Qasra, just outside the local Chaldean Catholic church in the village of Ankawa, which is a suburb of the modern city of Erbil. We also find that many Assyrian villages are built very close to important archaeological sites with rock carvings, one of them being the village of Maltaye, which you can see at the top, has a series of Assyrian rock carvings. For those who are following the news, these rock carvings this year were vandalized with the Kurdish flag. They were all over Facebook and Twitter. And you can see to the top left of that carving that there is like a little hermitage, and I'm going to come to that. Down the bottom is an image of the site of Shero Maliktha, which is just in